And here we go, 2021. Welcome everybody to Raising Multilinguals Live. My name is Tetsu Young from Ask Tetsu, wishing you a fantastic start to your new year. Go ahead.
And my name is Utili Macharibol from Uta's International Lounge. Welcome everyone.
And I'm Rita Rosenbach from Multilingual Parenting.com, wishing you a happy, healthy 2021.
Woo! I am all jittery and excited and maybe even a little bit nervous. It is our first session of 2021, so I wanted to get everything right. I think I've gone through my SOP a few times and memorized all my text now. I don't memorize anything.
SOP, Tetsu sometimes throws things around. What's SOP?
SOP, Standard Operating Procedures.
Yeah.
We all have those standard operating procedures. It's a little memo I have stuck on my desk. Oh,
also called Post-it note.
That's right. It's a lot of things to check, you know, when you go through these steps for the live stream. I always forget one little thing, but so far so good, right? So far so good. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our very special guest for this kickoff meeting for 2021. So we have Dr. Shereen Sharaan, recently doctorized. Is that a word?
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
2020, I think, was a great year for you in that perspective. We met in 2017 in Iceland, and that was at the Polyglot Conference. And it's generally for people who love languages in general. But Shereen was there, I was there to talk about raising multilingual children or any topics that's related to that. And I think one of the big themes at that meeting was on autism. They actually had a very special guest, Daniel Tammet, who's actually pretty very well known in that in the world as he's on the autism spectrum, but he can learn new languages very quickly, and he learned Icelandic in, I don't know, like 2 weeks or something. 1 week. It was just amazing. So it was a real privilege to be able to see that, and it was a real privilege to meet Shereen. So welcome to Raising Multilinguals Live. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us on this very important topic of bilingualism and autism. No, I don't think many people would associate it very, directly, but let's get right into it then. Shereen, maybe, talk us a little bit about yourself. Why are we talking about autism and bilingualism in the first place? How all this is, personal to you, and why are you on this mission? Go, you have about 1 hour.
Perfect.
No, just kidding.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me, first off. It's a real pleasure to kick off 2021 with this public engagement activity. Here's hoping to like a lot more throughout the year. So as Tetsu just mentioned, I'm recently doctorized from the University of Edinburgh, and I did my PhD in psychology. Just wrapped it up last month, and specifically focusing on the impact of speaking two languages on the thinking skills of autistic children. So, that's a pretty good question to kick off this discussion. Like, why are we even talking about this in the first place? Why does this matter? Well, so to start off, we know three things that are quite key to this conversation. So number one, we know that more people worldwide are becoming bilingual. Number two, we know that the rate of diagnosing an individual with autism is also increasing. That's also on the rise. Number three, we know that parents and practitioners have concerns surrounding raising autistic children speaking more than one language, because there seems to be this widespread notion that, another language will be too much, and that it could be overtaxing, and it could disadvantage these children both in verbal and nonverbal domains. So given these worldwide statistics about autism, about bilingualism, and given the concerns that, we've received from parents and practitioners, it just raises the question, what kind of impact does bilingualism have on autistic children? So more specifically, there are many different domains here. There are verbal domains, nonverbal domains. I focus on a nonverbal domain called thinking skills. The scientific term for it is executive functions. And so this refers to things like your working memory, sustained attention, inhibition skills, cognitive flexibility. We use these executive skills on a daily basis, just to complete all sorts of activities. It's been shown to predict social skills, academic achievement, mental and physical health, quality of life, and even staying out of jail. So thinking skills are my area of focus. And the thing is, if we do not explore this question, what is the impact of bilingualism on autistic children, and particularly within this domain, we are left without the evidence that we need to support the children's linguistic and cognitive development. And unfortunately, again, without the evidence, we give way to unfounded notions instead of the evidence-based findings, which ultimately leads to denying autistic individuals the language familiarity that they need to take part in their daily lives and to just be part of their families and their communities. So just think, if you weren't bilingual, if you were denied the option of being bilingual, just think how that would impact your life, and it could potentially, compromise your identity, your social communication inside and outside the home, employment opportunities, so just boundless opportunities that you would have missed out on had you not been bilingual. So in essence, yes, this is why it is important, because the research that we produce at this front could potentially, it does have the power to impact practice, education, and policy, especially because at the moment, we only have a handful of studies that are published worldwide to date. So, we're surfing a pretty new wave here, that we know very little about. So to answer your question, that's why it's really important to look into.
Yeah. So I think before we go too deep specifically, how should we define, I mean, for those of you, for perhaps our viewers who are not really familiar with autism,
right.
per se, because we all hear it's a spectrum, what does that
Yes.
mean? And these, some people call it disorder, some people call it disability. Well, how do you sort of make autism easier to understand for those of you for the audience who are not really familiar with autism? That could maybe, add the emphasis on how this is important, how much people, how many kids are affected. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a superb thing to point out, particularly very early on in the discussion. So the autism being a spectrum means that individuals will vary widely in their abilities across various social and cognitive domains. So essentially that is what it is. And as far as terms like dysfunction, disorder, difference, disability. So what the evidence tells us is that the autism is a brain difference. And so when the evidence has been synthesized on a biological level, genetic level, neurological level, cognitive level, behavioral levels, we see the evidence of difference, not dysfunction. And so I would refer to, obviously we know the DSM-5 still refers to autism as the autism spectrum disorder, but what the research points out is that it is the autism spectrum conditions, the evidence of brain difference, and it falls under the umbrella term of neurodiversity, which is basically, all brains. So that's not just brains with specific conditions like ADHD or the autism, that's you, me, everybody else. So we all fall under that umbrella term. So yes, I would refer to autism either as autism or the autism spectrum conditions.
Fantastic. So, okay, now that we know the differences and sort of better understand the jargon, I guess, what exactly are the highlights, I guess, in the evidence-based, the research around the world? Well, what does the data tell us?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, so studies have focused on different domains of the impact. So while some are focused on verbal domains, others are focused on nonverbal domains. The domain I focus on, for example, is nonverbal, and as I mentioned, is specific to thinking skills. And as far as thinking skills are concerned, researchers have either found an evidence of an advantage for autistic bilinguals, which means that autistic bilingual children had better performance in their thinking skills relative to their monolingual peers in different domains. So sometimes it could be flexible switching, which is cognitive flexibility, like how how able are you to switch between one task to the next? So this ability to switch back and forth, or in domains like sustained attention, how well can you stay focused on a task, for example. But that is kind of one finding. So it's been one of two findings. Either we have found an advantage in specific domains, or we have found no disadvantage, which means that while autistic children didn't do better than their monolingual peers, they also were not worse off. So the performance was equivalent. And so the most consistent finding across the literature, as far as, at least the nonverbal domain of thinking skills is concerned, is that being bilingual did not harm children's thinking skills, specifically, obviously within, I'm speaking about the autistic samples here that were used. When we move on to the verbal domains, that finding still persists. So there has been no evidence that speaking a second language in autistic children will add further delay to their language development. And so basically, these are the two things that these are the two main findings from the literature. So not only can autistic children become proficient bilinguals and function successfully in both languages, but the finding of no negative impact of bilingualism has been pretty consistent. It is a robust finding found across the literature. Mm-hmm. There is one key limitation that I think is really worth sharing with the current evidence base as a whole. And that is that the research samples are not representative of the wider autistic community. So in the sense that, so the studies so far published to date, and again, they're just a handful, they focused on children that are more cognitively abled. So in this sense, more verbal, enrolled in mainstream schools, and also in terms of age, mainly between the ages of 5 and 12. So would our findings still stand true if we change any of these parameters? We don't know. We would need replications and extensions on diverse samples of autistic children in order to determine to what extent can we generalize this finding.
Okay, so first of all, almost a real sigh of relief, I think, for a lot of parents out there to hear from an expert like yourself saying that the research, at least so far, what's out there, does not suggest any disadvantage for autistic children to, the research says that learning a second language will not affect other cognitive functions, right?
Well, so I specifically zoom in on, so in the verbal domain, when it comes to language learning, there has been no evidence of, let's say, a further language delay in autistic children as a result of being exposed to a bilingual environment or a second language. In the nonverbal domain, also at least the domain that I'm focusing on, because I'm guessing there are other things like social cognition and so on, which we still lack data to talk about more confidently. But as far as thinking skills are concerned, there's been no evidence to suggest that, by learning a second language, you would essentially you would have poorer thinking skills compared to a monolingual peer who's also on the spectrum.
Yes, so I see that learning a language does not negatively or adversely affect the children. What about, do autistic children have more difficulty to learn a second language, sort of going the other way? Do you see what I'm trying to say? If you learn a language, will that cause problems? For the moment, we're saying the research does not suggest that. But do they have a disadvantage in learning languages? Because like I mentioned earlier, we had Daniel Tammet, who was at the Polyglot conference. He was a genius level in terms of learning languages. Do you think this would be a general thing? Is this applicable to other autistic children? Do they have advantages, disadvantages?
Yeah. So something really, really, really important to keep in mind is that, we were talking earlier about the autism being a wide spectrum. And so, yes, we have these reassuring findings as far as bilingualism is concerned, but is bilingualism for everyone? Probably not, because we have to factor in certain things here in order to make language decisions for children. So aside from the evidence, which is reassuring on that front, you also have to factor in children's abilities, children's the preferences, family dynamics, family preferences.
Absolutely.
So these are all factors to be taken into consideration as to whether, you know, you think language learning will be more feasible for some children as opposed to others.
Yes. So, but I think it's important to note that that is not, you know, any different from a normal family raising a second child. So that is really good, I think, for parents to really, I think, to know that their kid is special, but from a language learning perspective, they're basically the same. You should treat them the same in terms of learning abilities and also all the limitations that you think that could cause the family. It's really no different from an autistic child and a non-autistic child.
Yeah, and I mean, I do see where like families and say some the practitioners could be coming from, because we do know, as far as like the autism is concerned, there is some evidence of like language delays earlier on. But as far as like saying that learning a second language will delay that first language, will disadvantage you linguistically, we have no evidence to say that that is the case. So far, autistic children bilingual kids have either performed equivalently in like the verbal domains, or they've had some advantages in like nonverbal domains, or also again equivalently. So yes, I mean, there are some language delays, generally speaking, when you're speaking about the autism as a spectrum, but because so I do see where that notion could have, you know, initially come to life, but that's why it was so important to generate research to look at whether speaking a second language would in fact disadvantage that, or even cause further delay, which it doesn't so far.
Can I kind of take it to the other side? Let's say a child has been exposed to 2 languages, or maybe even more from birth, and then the child gets diagnosed to be on the autistic spectrum. And at that point, we have experience from this, because we heard it from parents. They've often been told to kind of make it easier for the child to drop a language. And obviously, based on what you're saying here, that is not right. But could it even be worse than that? What would removing a language that the child has grown up with and created a relationship with the parent, by dropping that? So what would you like to say to that?
Well, I would like to say that, so to start off, I would have to say that language, as I mentioned earlier, is key to forming ethnic identities, social communication within the home, outside the home, and just a really vast, like, you know, world of opportunities. And the problem we have at the moment is that policymakers, practitioners, so on, so some of them are continuing to give this piece of advice to families, but I to emphasize that this piece of advice is not based on scientific evidence. The collective evidence we have to date points to either some advantage in some areas of thinking skills, or no disadvantage. And as far as verbal domains are concerned, the performance of a bilingual autistic child is pretty equivalent to the monolingual autistic child in terms of like language learning. So it hasn't caused further delay. That's exactly what we're trying to change by doing, you know, this kind of like dissemination, public engagement activities, is to communicate the research that we have collectively produced. So it's not just my research. I mean, my research is one study, and the studies that we have at you know, at this interface are not many. So I would say it's just a handful, but that is growing and growing and growing. And as a unit, collectively, they've put forward evidence which encourages parents to use the language that they are comfortable speaking with to their child. And in if they're going to be making any decisions related to language with their children, they should factor in, number one, the evidence that we have. Number two, the child's abilities and the preferences. Number two, three, family dynamics and the preferences. Combined, that is the best decision making that you can make for the child.
Yes.
So what we are basically saying is that we, instead of doing something which is beneficial for the child, dropping a language, following incorrect advice, could actually mean that the parents are doing something that harms the child more instead, if they drop a language.
I mean, so obviously following this advice unknowingly and without factoring into, you know, the equation, the evidence or the child's abilities or the preferences or the family dynamics, that's the issue that we're dealing with. The autistic individuals are being denied the opportunity to have another language, to be bilingual. And unfortunately, we also see that is being reflected in certain the policies worldwide. So we're really hoping to, I mean, so at the moment, my colleagues and I at the University of Edinburgh, we're putting together a policy brief. And so we're just putting together more and more documents, doing more talks, more dissemination to reach a wider, you know, the body of people, just to basically just communicate the evidence that we have and make better decisions for autistic children.
Yeah,
maybe, yeah.
Go ahead.
I read a few articles about research connected with bilingual children and maintaining the home languages, the importance to maintain the home languages also for emotional reasons, because you make an emotional bond with your child while using your language, which is for children on the autistic spectrum, not only for them, for all the children actually, very, very important, but maybe for some on the autistic spectrum even more, for several reasons that you are the expert to talk about. So maybe we should point this out as well as one of the reasons to not abandon a family language. I'm now thinking of the families who have a different language than the community language. So not thinking of bilingualism as an additional language to the community language, but really need to keep this bond alive throughout countries, if you want.
Yes, it's definitely something that families need to deeply consider. And I completely understand that is the global evidence that we have, advice that we have at the moment, but the evidence is as such, and it reveals findings in both verbal and nonverbal domains. So these are, you know, all domains that parents need to look at and consider. And at this point, I'm also just communicating the evidence, but I'm also really happy to share resources for parents and papers and articles so that they themselves can look into this and obviously have proper discussions about this. And I'm also really, really happy to obviously answer the questions that they might have. So resources will definitely be shared with them.
That's great, because I have a question. You almost answered my question before. I have a question from Juji, who runs a wonderful Facebook group called Bilingual Children with Developmental Differences. We can add a link to the comments and put them in the show notes afterwards. And he is in Japan, so unfortunately not able to attend live, but he sent in a question where he asks, I'll read it here so I get it right. From time to time, I get parents contacting me through my group from all around the world who have, with or without diagnosis, realized that their child may have developmental issues. In many cases, they face pressure from their doctors, teachers, or often spouses to abandon the minority language. What advice would you give to parents in this situation in particular? And in particular, what studies would you point to as the best way that they can explain to others that bilingualism may not be harmful?
Yeah, so kind of to summarize what we were talking about, the evidence base that we have on this topic, both in verbal and nonverbal domains, says that bilingualism does not harm language learning in autistic children, nor does it harm their thinking skills. In fact, it can sometimes produce some advantages for some groups. While there are the limitations of those studies, the key one being that, again, these samples are not representative of the entire community, but still, I mean, this is the evidence base that we have at the moment, and it wasn't, you know, like that tight in terms of samples. I mean, we had varying degrees of proficiencies and exposure and switching between two languages, and pretty much focused on children like ages 5 to 12. So as far as the evidence is concerned, I would actually, put forward my voice, and I'm sure that my colleagues at the interface who have produced the findings, and encourage parents to use these findings in combination with their child's ability and the language preferences, as combined with the preferences as a family and your family dynamics, to make informed decisions about your children's language decisions, to basically, so their abilities, their goals in terms of language. The studies that I would like to point out, so I mean, these, I've just included them in my thesis, beginning with most recently published was my own, so that is by Sharaan et al. 2020. We also have a study by Gonzalez Tabarero 2017, Airochi 2017, Lee et al. 2017, Ratto et al. 2020, Howard et al. 2019.
Fantastic.
They're all very recent, and what we'll
very recent.
We'll put those in the show notes
yes.
for the people to check. So I'll get those from you after the call.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, they're all published in the last 3 years.
Like you say, there's not a lot of resources out there. So whatever guidelines and things that, the resources that you are creating, has tremendous value for the parents out there. So
just to double check, because we come across this so often, will these resources be free to read?
Oh, I mean, yes. I mean, so some of them are and won't require a subscription, and especially mine, I'm happy to upload the paper, so that's not an issue. So I'll just shoot that to you, and you're very welcome to share it with the families.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So, all right. So at this, we're kind of past already 30 minutes. Wow. Already, this goes by so fast. I do want to once again acknowledge everybody who's watching on watching this live right now. Thank you so much for tuning in. We've got a few comments in our chat box right now. We've got Harumi saying Happy New Year. Again, Happy New Year to everybody watching right now. And we've got Yoshito, and we've got Mohammed. Who's Mohammed?
I think Mohammed Anand must know you.
That's right.
Yes, he does. That is my husband. That's him. Yes.
Good.
He says he's very proud of you. I'm also very proud of you. We've got Rania El Minshawi. I think this is your a
friend, my soul sister.
Soul sister. There you go. There you go.
We have a question from a Mohammed, maybe.
Yes.
Autistics have both expressive and receptive language difficulties. So what is the impact of bilingualism on both domains?
Yeah, I mean, so while this isn't a particular, say, finding from my PhD, because it's not a domain that I looked at directly, parallel studies have shown that autistic children perform equivalently. Bilingual autistic children perform equivalently to their monolingual peers. So there's the evidence of a further language delay to expressive and the receptive domains as a result of being bilingual. Something that is just important to note about bilingualism in general, so this is also from typically developing literature, bilinguals in general will have a smaller vocabulary in each language if you take them separately. But if you total their vocabulary, it's equivalent to their peers and sometimes larger.
Yes. There is another question from Yuri. When do we have to apply a functional criteria regarding to the learning of one or two language with autistic children?
Can I ask Yuri to elaborate on what they mean by functional criteria?
Yes, I think she heard you. Let's
Thank
see
you.
what she adds.
We give it a, should we give it a minute to?
Yeah.
Maybe
see.
maybe it's maybe
You-
we can expand, because we were talking about, you were talking about the nonverbal, right? And the verbal. What about
Domains, yes.
for reading and writing? Maybe she means that. I don't know. I'm trying to bridge here.
Oh no, that's fine. So actually, I think, I mean, until Yuri gives a more kind of like a breakdown of this point, what I can think of that can be possibly relevant. So in terms of like defining bilingualism, what markers do we use? What parameters do we use? Typically speak, I mean, so bilingualism can refer to people who know two languages, and what that means is we have certain the markers. There is no universal definition for who is bilingual. Some people think, and some actually academics, scholars think that learn maybe like 20 words makes you bilingual, and somebody else thinks that no, you should actually be equally proficient in two languages. So there's no consensus on who is bilingual, but we do have key markers of to bilingualism, and that includes things like age of acquisition of your second language, because, you know, if you have it like since birth, you're kind of like a simultaneous to bilingual. You've learned them both at the same time, whereas you could be more sequential and learned one and then later learned the second one. Another marker of bilingualism is language proficiency. How proficient are you in your language? How bilingual are you in that sense? Do you have high, medium, or low proficiency? And finally, I think an important one I would say is how frequently do you switch between your two languages? So these are all functional kind of like markers of bilingualism. And we use these things to actually create a threshold for who is bilingual and how bilingual are they and what type of bilingual
Yes, she added that she meant the language that we use in the daily life. So I imagine just in everyday conversations that we have with the autistic children.
So as I understand, the question is you talked about this before, what to take into consideration whether a child learns one or two languages. So how
Yes.
important it is in the daily life, and which language a child will need.
Yeah. So if the question is like which language like the child usually like needs more in like a functional day-to-day capacity,
yeah,
I mean that would predominantly depend on the language environment that they are in. So while children, for example, so I myself am almost trilingual, and so basically something important to mention here is in terms of like the environment that I am in. I live in a country that has a dual language switching environment, so we constantly switch back and forth between Arabic and the English here. But I do have one language that is more dominant than the other. And it depends on the situation. Actually, if the situation is a bit emotional, I could revert back to my native language. If the situation is more professional, I'm at work or I'm doing a talk like here now, even if the speakers were bilingual and spoke both my languages, again, my dominant language would still be English as far as these talks are concerned. So yeah, I think in every day-to-day capacities, children will usually, I mean, people in general will demonstrate a dominant language in a particular context. And it just really depends on who they're speaking to, what kind of environment they're in, why do they need to speak that language at that particular moment in time.
Yes,
I hope I've touched on your point, yeah.
Yeah, if I understand you right, what you're saying now is that actually consider autistic children or non-autistic on the spectrum, not on the spectrum, the way that they will use the languages are determined by the same facts independently if they are on the autistic spectrum or not.
Yeah, I mean, pretty similar because, I mean, we're in the pretty much, you know, we both have to you know, basically function in like daily capacities, various social skills, various kind of like community activities.
Relationships.
So yeah.
Yeah, which then also answers a little bit the next question that we have from Abu. Are autistic bilingual children able to learn a third language? And I guess it applies the same if they need it, or if they have the ability to have someone around them to foster that language, they might, I think. Or
yes, that is the wonderful the question. Yes, they definitely can. And again, so this would really depend on the person's situation, their abilities, the preferences. There is actually recent research that my colleague had done at the University of Edinburgh, but it's with the adults who were children at some point. And so it's just the research revealed that the autistic sample was competently multilingual. And there are people who spoke up to maybe 13 languages, 15 the languages each. I don't know how proficient they are in each of those languages, but it just goes to show that, yes, of course, just like, typically developing individuals, autistic people have the capacity to learn language, no limits there as far as how many languages that they could learn, at least when you're speaking relative to typically developing people, I would say it's equivalent. There's nothing to suggest that they can't.
Well, I think it's really comforting to know that there's just really no difference to speak of, in the way you would approach languages from an autistic child or a non-autistic child. I think from that perspective, they both have the same limitations and same restrictions and the same abilities and the capabilities from all perspectives. There's just no really a good reason to treat them differently, I think.
Yeah, and something that's really cool also to point out now that I think of it, so this is, across typically developing literature and also atypical. So we were talking earlier about how some bilingual children, whether they're autistic or typically developing, could have advantages in their thinking skills because they're bilingual. So that's a key finding, for example, but of course it's not without debate. Especially in typically developing the literature, there's plenty of debate there. Is there an advantage? Is there not? Definitely there have been some studies that have shown that, but something that's really interesting to point out is that sometimes the advantage in specific domains depends on how similar the two languages are. So for example, the more overlap in terms of, just linguistically between two languages, for example, English and Spanish versus English and Chinese. So the greater the language similarity between, the language one and the language two, the greater the advantage in particular domains. For example, like interference control, like how good are you at resisting interference from distracting information or a distracting language. So yeah, I mean, that's just something that would be interesting to point out because it's the same across different types of the literature. It has more to do with the language, something called linguistic distance. And so the smaller the distance between the two languages, because there is greater the overlap. So that just exercises your interference control more. And so when you exercise a specific executive skill more, it just becomes more robust, and sometimes they show an advantage in that particular domain.
Mm-hmm. I think we mentioned this in the episode with Thomas Bach.
Dr. Oh, Thomas yes. Edinburgh. He's also from the University of Edinburgh. Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. All right. I think we've gotten through the questions from our audience for now. I mean, if you have more, don't be shy. You can put some more in there. But I'm going to go down my list here. For now, we're going to come back in and talk to Shereen about. So I've read that autism can generally be diagnosed relatively early. Some even under 2 years old. But what do you think about the importance of actually diagnosing early in in relation to languages and bilingualism? Specifically?
Right. Well, so as we mentioned earlier, so there are a range of markers that we use to define bilingualism. And those markers, some of them have been linked to enhanced thinking skills in bilinguals. And so those include, your proficiency in the language, your age of acquisition. So here comes the point of the age, the actual age, and also the age of your second language acquisition, as well as the frequency of switching between both of your languages. So these are all key markers that have been shown to have an influence on the impact of bilingualism. So while age has been highlighted as a key factor in the literature, I think, so still also the definition of early bilinguals varies across the literature. In my study, I adopted a definition that says you're an early bilingual if you start learning the second language before the age of 7. Other studies maybe have used 6, 5, 4. Definitely nothing like 2 or the less than that, 2 or 3 or like so on. But yes, so yeah, up until like the age of 7 or so, you're an early bilingual. Theoretically speaking, and I think that's where the discussion will get more interesting, I think the theory, especially those ones that are grounded in neurobiology, that basically chart the relationship theoretically between bilingualism and thinking skills. So why would speaking a second language even lead to an advantage in your thinking skills? Where is that link coming from? And there are many theories that have been put forward. A general one, kind of like a general working hypothesis, is that when you know 2 languages, so you have 2 active languages in your head, but when I'm speaking one, for example, I'm exercising other thinking skills. For example, if I'm speaking now in English, I am inhibiting the Arabic and the bit of the Japanese that I might know. And at the same time, I'm using sustained attention to keep speaking to you in the English. And if I would like to switch to Arabic, I'd also be using cognitive flexibility to switch from one language to the other. So this also extends to like a daily situation, like driving a car, learning how to drive. You would need to use your working memory to keep information in place. You would need to use your sustained attention to keep driving the car. You'd need to, flexibly switch between signals and so on and so on, and also use your inhibition to not, get distracted. And I'm also using that now. I'm resisting interference from my native language because some words will come to me in Arabic, but I'm choosing to, not engage that and just focus on this language. So that's just theoretically why there could be a link there between, bilingualism and enhanced executive skills, because also frequent, switching or frequent use of both languages will theoretically to exercise these particular thinking skills more and more and more. And so once you do that, we can hypothesize, from a theory perspective, an advantage.
One quick note that we had Ellen Bialystok on one of our interviewers. So those of you who are listening now want to know even more about that, then go and look up the episode with Ellen Bialystok, because she's talking exactly about this too.
Yes.
Definitely.
Can I maybe ask another question? It's very interesting from Yelena. Since we're talking about the spectrum, what is the correlation between the existence of 1, 2, or several languages in a child and their cognitive capacities? A child with Kanner autism and Asperger's don't have it the same, right? And then she adds further up. So what I mean is, based on what position of the spectrum you base your results and conclusions that bi or multilingualism is as achievable as is in neurotypical children?
Yes, so if I understood the question correctly, basically, I would like to emphasize again, so the samples of autistic children that were included in the study. So first of all, Asperger's is no longer in the DSM-5 criteria. It's been merged, it's basically we have the autism. But as far as like abilities are concerned, as far as like where are you in the spectrum, those studies, because of the cognitive batteries that they used, because they wanted to assess. Sorry, did you want to add something? Because no, you didn't. You're okay. So those studies used, a mix of measures. Some of them really focused on using computerized the measures. So kind of like games, cognitive games, working memory, sustained attention, so on, so on, so on. And for those, they needed children, within a certain cognitive capacity. So those studies, typically recruited more cognitively abled, autistic children. So they were, typically verbal. They went to the mainstream school. I think most of them had an IQ of 70 and above. So that's kind of like the average, the range. And in terms of age, yeah, just 5 to 12. So the findings that we have are based on these parameters within the spectrum. But even within that sample, there was great heterogeneity. So I found that on one of the studies in the PhD. So when you compare autistic children as a group, as an average, to typically developing children, their performance was lower on executive function skills. In fact, it showed that it was impaired on pretty much, you know, all the thinking skills. But when you analyze autistic children individually, so you look at the data person by the person, you can see that on an individual level, the majority of autistic children actually performed equivalently to their typically developing peers, which confirms what we know about the autism being a very heterogeneous condition, that it is a spectrum with the children and individuals widely varying in their abilities and capacities across both social and cognitive domains. So that's also a really key finding from the study, that even when compared to a typically developing person on an individual level, they showed, you know, the same performance. And that's the danger of analyzing data as an average, taking people as a group. This is what we're missing. And this is what we were able to reveal when we did a multiple case series. So that's just a type of analysis where you look at people individually and then compare that data. So thanks for her question, because we, you know, went a bit deeper, but I think that's a really important insight, and it confirms that the autism is a spectrum condition.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's very important also for those parents who received maybe the diagnosis that their child is on the spectrum, and they try to find out what is possible, what is not, and then be exposed. I mean, you have to become, as a parent, you have to become like the expert for your child, and that is very helpful to have someone like you explain it with these words, and yeah, encouraging these families. It's very valuable. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. We've talked a lot about autism. For me, you know, it's not a range that touches me directly, but it's a very important topic. And I wanted to ask you, I'm sure a lot of it's already answered in our discussion so far, but I wanted to ask you how the knowledge that's out there right now on bilingualism and autism can be applied to other types of disabilities or disorders, you know, differences. You know, for example, dyslexia maybe is one thing that comes to mind. Is there anything that's applicable directly, you think?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, while this isn't, you know, within my ken, but this is like a long journey of the PhD, and during that journey, I've come across some like parallel studies with other populations. So obviously away from typically developing populations. In the verbal domain, so when we were talking about language learning, the results of the previous studies that I had talked about, which, you know, they reached a consensus that bilingualism does not harm language learning. It didn't contribute to any further delay in the language learning. I would say that this is in line with the research on bilingual exposure in children with specific language impairment and also children with Down syndrome. So that's as far as like the verbal domain is concerned. Just a couple of examples of like maybe like 3 or 4 studies that were at the interface with these two types of groups. As far as the nonverbal domain is concerned, so bilingualism, there are a couple of studies that I had come across recently, and I see that bilingualism had provided an advantage on some occasions in children with reading difficulties, but it did not have that effect on the other occasions. And I think that also what factored into this, I mean, there were so many factors, right? I mean, they even defined bilingualism differently. Every study will do this, so they'll have different, you know, the parameters of proficiency. But I think how difficult the text was really played a role here in terms of whether the bilingual advantage could emerge or not, but also other parameters like proficiency of the children, the age range of the children, and so on. So yes, in children with reading difficulties, there have been some evidence of an advantage and some evidence of no advantage, but that also means no disadvantage. I'm not aware of like extensively of like all the studies that were done on this particular population, but from the reading that I've done on like different samples, so there still seems to be that pattern, generally speaking, that bilingualism did not harm their thinking skills, nor did it add to further delay. And so this is pretty much studies that are focused on children. I think there are also studies that are focused on like teenagers or younger adults, the older adults. I think there's a relatively recent paper, 2015, that showed a somewhat of a disadvantage in adults, like younger adults with the ADHD. But then again, I haven't really gone, into lengths with what kind of like methodology did they use, what kind of measures. I myself used about 3 different types of measures. I used a computerized battery of measures, number 1, to directly assess thinking skills in children. So they would play on a computer a game. And so that game was basically picking up on abilities like sustained attention, working memory, and so on and so on. But then I also did parent reports of thinking skills. So I gave parents like a questionnaire, and they would assess their children's thinking skills in daily life context. And so that's a very different measure, because a computer measure is I'm just measuring your thinking skills at one point in time for 20 minutes. Whereas a parent rating is kind of like, assessing your daily life, behavior, maybe across a period of like 1 month, like 4 weeks. So it spans across a wider, time frame, and it gives us the insight into your abilities in a different, the context, for example, in the home. The third measure was the same measure as the parent measure, but with teachers. And so we're capturing thinking skills in the school context. And so there was a really big insight from using multiple measures, which is basically that executive function. There are different demands placed on thinking skills or executive functions depending on the context that you're in. Children are not going to behave the same way they do at home versus a school versus with me in like a lab setting where they have to play some games. So we found, like, let's say, the greatest strengths in executive function were with the computerized measures, followed by parents, followed by teachers. So teachers were able to pick up on more challenges and difficulties, again, maybe because the context that the children are in school, you're in a very, to organize the context, you have to function within a classroom. It's just very, very different demands of executive function. And it could be that teachers were more subtle. They could pick up on those like the challenges that children were facing in a school.
Yeah, I'm sure the teachers are very perceptive of their pupils. I wanted to come quickly back to the reading that but we also need to keep in mind when children learn to read, being any child, that there's a difference to how easy it is to learn to read one language and another. For example, I'm thinking of one of my mother tongues, Finnish, which is phonetical. So it's written exactly as it is pronounced. It is a lot easier for a child to learn to read in Finnish than it would be in French or English, for example. So this could be for a child on the spectrum, could be a big advantage if they can learn to read in a language where it's easier to start with. So that could be one of the advantages as well.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a very interesting point. It's not something I personally looked into, like linguistically, what could be easier for some children. But then, of course, I imagine there'd be very interesting factors to take into consideration here. Like, why is it easier, for example? So again, it might not be easier to everyone, but there are things, there are factors going into that equation, like their exposure, maybe in terms of patterns. Like that's what Daniel did, Kitetsu, if you remember, at the Polyglot, the conference in 2017. So I think one of his techniques was just like assigning colors to like just to kind of like have a threshold for difficulty, like easy words, difficult words, so on, so on. I think he also assigned colors for different reasons, but that was something that they used to kind of like ease the transition into like learning a new language. So there are really cool strategies there that people would, different types of people would employ to make it easier to learn a language.
Fantastic. We have a few, we have at least one more question. I don't know if we have time for any more, because we are getting close to the hour. Would you
how
be,
time flies.
yeah, Shereen, would you be able to maybe answer also in the comments afterwards?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, that's fantastic.
Thank you guys for asking.
Yeah. Well, I every year at the beginning of the year, I'm afraid that, you know, suddenly it's going to be December. It's like another year over. But I've fully enjoyed this session. I'm actively enjoying it. And I'm going to actively enjoy the rest of our sessions also. But today, very unfortunately, we have come up close to the end of this interview. A lot of things you've discussed in depth. You know, thank you very much again for sharing your expertise. And, you know, your words are so impactful. And we were just wondering if you could take one message, one strong message that you could have for the parents out there to encourage them, to give them more wisdom. What would that be? Just a very simple message from you, the expert.
Yeah, you know, actually that was a question that I was asked at my PhD Viva, or as maybe some people will call it, the defense, is that if you just had to take like a take-home message, like from your research, what would that be? And in this case, it would be, so I would like to emphasize that the evidence base that we have to date on the impact of bilingualism on thinking skills in autistic children, but also the impact of bilingualism on language learning in autistic children has shown either some advantages for bilingual autistic children, or it has shown no disadvantage. So the most consistent finding has been that bilingualism does not harm thinking skills in the autistic children, nor does it provide, you know, nor does it contribute to a further delay in the language learning. And so with that in mind, parents, the impact on practice, on families, on policy, on the education is that these units should be encouraged to use the language that you are comfortable with, you know, speaking to your child, and take into consideration, in parallel to the evidence that we have, the child's abilities in terms of like language, because obviously like some children are nonverbal, and so that's something for us to kind of like address and not take into, you know, the picture just like blindly. So the child's abilities, his or her, the preferences, the preferences as parents, as a family, and the family dynamics and the language environment that supports the child. So that would be the take home, the message for me. And I would also advise parents to, yes, aside from, you know, attending these public engagement activities where they can like hear from researchers and the scientists, is to also take the time to check out the resources that we share, so that you can come to your own conclusion here, really. I mean, you need to look at this yourself and see what works best for your family, you know, taking into consideration those like family factors in combination with the evidence that we provide, thanks to your help. So obviously without your research participation, please keep that up. We wouldn't have any research to share to begin with. And so yes, we're hoping to expand that research to more diverse samples in order to be able to produce some generalizable data within the wider autistic community. So thank you guys for tuning in.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you. It is, again, a very encouraging message to all the, very empowering message to the parents out there. I kind of feel like I can advise certain parents with autistic children, at least to a very superficial level at the current time, with what I found out today. So thank you for empowering me too. And you were talking about language policies and you know, things to do inside the home. We have a great session coming up. The next one is something along those lines, and I will have Ute discuss our next session. So give me 1 second. I'm going to put it up on the screen.
Yes.
We'll give you a little preview on what's coming up in 2 weeks.
Yes, in 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Yes, on the 19th of January, we will have Professor Elisabeth Lanza from the Department of Linguistics and Scandinavian Studies at the University of Oslo in Norway, and director of the Center for Multilingualism in Society Across the Lifespan, also called Multiling, for those who know it, a center of excellence funded by the Research Council of Norway, talking about family language policies and practices. So we are very much looking forward to this next interview on Tuesday, 19th of January, 1 p.m. New York, 6 p.m. London, and 7 p.m. Paris.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ute, for that little introduction. Once again, thank you so much, Shereen, for your expertise.
Thank you, guys.
I also want to thank everybody who's tuned in to watch our first show of the year. I'm so excited. We had a fantastic session today, and fantastic is actually my opinion. I want to know your opinion. So I'm going to put in a little link in the comments right now. I don't know where it came up, but it's for a feedback. So your feedback is so important for us to improve these interviews time after time. We've gotten some great ones so far, so we're improving it as we go. So thank you again, everybody, for tuning in. We will see you again in 2 weeks, January 19th, same time, same channel. Okay? Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Shereen.
Thank you, Shereen.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye, guys.
Bye.